I will try to project. If you can hear me, can you hear me clearly? Okay, so my husband's right, I do speak loud. If I go too fast, please tell me, all right? It's no problem. I do, every audience, 40 plus years teaching, but every audience is a new one, and sometimes I do kind of rush it through. The program today, as you heard, is Afro-Caribbean Migration to Florida. It's going to be focusing on basically the 300 years first of Spanish history and the foundation of Florida history. That first settlement and these communities, Afro-Caribbean, that came here during the first days of the colonization of Florida. And then where these groups came in later, that's called the Afro-Caribbean diaspora, and some general information. Not too much on today because their presence has changed, but it gives you an idea of their long history. All of the music that you heard were, I call it island hopping. They're Caribbean sounds. Each one was from a different island. You could hear the difference, right? Each one was unique. Originally they had the names. I don't know where the island names went. But what they all share in common is every single one of them has a foundation on European sounds and European instruments. If you really listen, like the Haitian, trumpets, horns, very strong. The Puerto Rican preciosa, that was a piano, it was a vals, these are very traditional. But it also has the drums, the Afro tradition, and the native. You're going to have a lot of the marimba, you're going to have the cha-chas, which are both Native American, and you also have a similar item from Africa. So you have this music that is all from one foundation, the linking of these three traditions that in each island manifested differently, because although the Spanish were the first to come, you know that the islands are very diverse, and that's what I'm going to focus on today, that diversity also. Okay, the first one that I played was Caribbean Sounds from Harry Belafonte, all right, in the 50s and 60s. He actually was born in Harlem, so that tells you how early this Caribbean migration was, very early. He was born in Harlem. His parents were Caribbean born from Jamaica. And what's interesting about him was that he would be one of the earliest crossover musicians. His music hit the American scene and it took off. And maybe some of you might remember, his island song, right? I don't have it now because I played it earlier, but this idea of, the nostalgia and the islands. And this is a very traditional feeling that you get from everybody who's from the Caribbean, even if they weren't born there, right? You have this feeling of the music and your family and your ancestors. So he was interesting because it's like this crossover music. He became one of the most popular musicians, singers in the United States. He hit like the top 100 #1 in New York City in those days. So he really was a very well-known artist, inducted into the Library of Congress's album because he's recognized as playing a significant role in that diffusion of music and culture and introducing the Caribbean sounds, especially Jamaica, this particular sounds, which should predate Marley, all right? Because the Marley sound and reggae is a different sound. I'm going to be speaking about Afro-Floridians because this is Afro-Caribbean migration to Florida. But where did they come from and when did they get here? So that you're going to see this early process of arriving and the different groups that arrived. And I'm going to focus on specific islands, and I'm going to focus on at least basically one Spanish, two English, if you see who they are, and one French, all right? Is it two English? Two English, one French. And we are going to look at their very early history and their connections to the development and exploration of Florida. One of the things that I wanted to talk about first is the idea of Black explorers, because this is what these individuals were when they came here. And some of them were enslaved Africans, but many of them were free. They came here as explorers with the Spanish conquistadores. And they were, in fact, all right, they were Black conquistadors. They played a major part in the conquest of the exploration and settlement of Florida, but also they were with Hernando de Soto when he discovered the Mississippi. His servants, which one of them was enslaved, one of them was free, was with him when he found the Mississippi. Coronado had his servants when, and actually an explorer, Esteban, who was one of 4 survivors from an exploration from Florida. He was one of the first persons to reach New Mexico and Arizona, and what we would know today as the Zuni people. So you had explorers with all of them, and we're going to see one of the first ones that came to Florida with Ponce de Leon. Now, Ponce de Leon is known as the discoverer in encounterer, settler. He didn't settle. He couldn't. Unfortunately, when he got here, the native population already knew about the settlement and conquest of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Hispaniola, which is present-day Dominican Republic and Haiti, because of the Arawaks that fled into Florida from enslavement. Because one of the first things the Spaniards did when they came to the Caribbean, and not just that, but we're talking about the first period, which is the Spanish period, 300 years, was enslave them. Because they did not come here to work. They wanted to be wealthy, they wanted to get positions and status. These are individuals that left Spain after the reconquest of Spain. They gained glory, but they had no money. And after the fall of the Muslim Empire, the last fall in Granada, the old nobility came back and reestablished itself. So you had all of these soldiers and all of these individuals that were called hidalgos. They were looking for power and wealth and position, but they were not going to get it in Spain. There was just not that system. If you know anything about that period in history, like England, you only had what was called a landed aristocracy. Land, but very few people controlled it, all right? So if you wanted land, you had to go somewhere else. And what was lucky about this period? Columbus had sailed west and encountered two continents. Two continents that were empty, according to some of the early stories, but two continents that were open to colonization, exploration, and it gave an opportunity. So this is what happens. These groups come here, and this is what they do. So Ponce de Leon is going to be the first expedition that comes, and I don't know if you can really see. Can you see the screen? Is it too bright or something, lights? Okay. So you see that he first, when Ponce de Leon first comes here to the Americas, he first comes to actually Hispaniola, because that was the center. That was the first colony or the settlement established by Columbus. He left some, one of the ships crashed, and that's where he leaves them. And Ponce de Leon will come and they'll do the conquest. That means basically controlling the native population and enslaving them. Then he will go to Puerto Rico, and that's where he's most known, because he still has some ruins there, Caparra, and he will subdue the population there. And what were they looking for? At this point, they were looking for gold. And they did find some. That was gold. That was the key thing that all of them were looking, wealth. And then from there, he will go to Cuba, right? Because Cuba was bigger, the mines, and now it's time to subdue them. He settles in Puerto Rico, but then he decides that he needs to leave because he was the governor of Puerto Rico, but Diego Colón, Christopher Columbus's son, gets that title because that was part of the agreement, that his heirs would have dominance, governorship, viceroyalty. So he needs adventure. He was already wealthy, but he needs adventure, he needs more. So he gets a contract to look for Bimini. Okay? And Bimini, the island that hosts the Fountain of Youth. Did he believe it existed? Most of the literature says no. But it may have been something that he got the king to agree to, because the king agreed. Because the king was getting old, and if there was a possibility, the king of Spain, a possibility that he could become young again, why not, right? But there's a lot of conjecture that really this was just maybe some legends that you have, even though in St. Augustine there's a part where the Fountain of Youth is supposed to be. So he comes to Florida, and he comes with a group of individuals that are explorers, and they include, right, individuals that were from different groups, and it includes one black conquistador, right? A free black man from originally Angola, went from Angola to Portugal, from Portugal to Sevilla, and ends up in Hispaniola. So he participated in the conquest of Hispaniola. Then he goes to Puerto Rico with Ponce de Leon. He goes to Cuba, so it's understood he goes to Florida. He participated in both. We know about them being there in two places, from two sources. The crew manifest, and that's what the kind of documents we look for. Because the Spanish had everything written down. It had to be. The king wanted to know everything. Because the wealth had to be accounted for and had to be carefully counted. And the king had to get their chunk first, and you could go, even Columbus ended up poor. A lot of the explorers that found all this gold and silver, they ended up in jail. There were a lot of issues with proving the money and that you didn't steal from the crown. But the good thing for us, for scholars, is all this information. You just have to look for it. So one of the places that we start is the manifest. And the manifest said that Ponce de Leon had one white slave who was probably a criminal or a war captive. We don't know from where, maybe from Spain. Another one was a woman, the first woman to set foot. She already had a Spanish name, Juana Diaz. She was from one of the islands in the Caribbean. This now they're coming from the Caribbean. And even if they have African ancestry, they're going to be what we call Afro-Spaniards, part of Spanish slavery. They were called Ladinos. They were Christian, Catholic. They spoke Spanish. The other group are called Mozales. These were the ones that were newly captured, and we don't have too many of them, not yet. So this woman, we don't know too much about her except that she was the first woman documented to have set foot in the Americas on the ship. And she was European. So she may have been mestizo, but it sounds like she was a European woman, maybe Spaniard, maybe from another country in Europe, we don't know. And then they mentioned that they were 2 free persons of African ancestry. No name on the manifest. But from one of the participants who did a Provenza, he asked for a pension from the king. He wrote why he needed a pension, he deserved it. So we know his story, but also from the records of that period, the conquest, and why he had to go back, because he had 2 trips. And the other gentleman was a translator. He was an Arawak translator who was part of the conquest of the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, Española, and Cuba. And the reason that his name was Juan González Ponce de Leon, because that was his sponsor. When he was free, he was not a slave. He was brought because the Arawaks from the Caribbean were already fleeing. And where were they fleeing to? Florida. Because they knew about that short little strip between Cuba and Florida, right? The channel. They knew about this, and there was actually a period of them moving. So they're going to do this process, and they're going to escape. So when he lands in Florida, he talks about the savage, how savage the natives are, but they knew what was going to happen. They had the story, this, and the Arawak translator, Gonzalez, was brought for that purpose. But again, what I want to emphasize is they were not enslaved. They came in as explorers. Now, they will come in, and we know the most about this gentleman, who is Juan Garrido, right? Again, born in Angola, Congo. Now, do we know what he looked like? No, not really. And if you go on the internet, there's so much wrong information, unfortunately. However, and the gentleman on the right, he has been listed forever as Juan Garrido. He is not Juan Garrido, but he was from the Congo. And this is what Juan Garrido probably looked like, because Juan Garrido was from south of the Sahara. He would have been a black African. Whereas the other gentleman on the left, if you see, he has more mulatto, more maybe North African, more Middle Eastern features. He's got more European features. So we don't know. But definitely, he was part of the conquistadores. He was with Columbus. And after Columbus, he would go to Mexico with Cortez. And based on his Provenza, he was one of the individuals that supposedly, right, went into the conquest of Tenochtitlan, which is the capture of Mexico City. He documents this. And we have this particular picture, this manuscript, which is from the native perspective. Because we have also some of these manuscripts from the Spanish, but this one I found interesting because it's from the native perspective. It's called the Aztec, doesn't show that. Okay, oops, sorry. It's called the Aztec Codex. So what they talk about is, there you have Malinche, okay, you see her here. Malinche is, the Doña Marina, she was the native interpreter that was Cortez, who basically, some people call her the traitor, because she was the one that translated for him and introduced and made alliances with other groups. Because Cortez got into Mexico City because he made alliances with other native populations that had been controlled by the Aztecs, and they wanted to break away from them. And here you have this gentleman who's obviously black. You can see the dark skin, you can see the hair. You notice he's holding a weapon, because they had weapons. He was a conquistador, right? Now, he may have been Juan Garrido or not, because he was not the only black conquistador that was part, but he may just be representative. But from his Provenza, his request for that pension, he was there, he says. He describes it, and the Spanish confirmed that he was there. He ended up living in Mexico City, got married there, married, I think, a Mexican woman, so she may have been Indian, or she may have been mestiza, Indian and European. He had children, he never got pension, but historically, he's the first person to actually grow wheat in the Americas. Right? So he's got some distinction. And he's an interesting character because, again, a black conquistador, and we had the documentation. And that's what's good about the Spanish. We have a lot of documentation. We're talking about the Afro-Caribbean, So this is the area that we're looking at, and I wanted to point out to these islands and how they are important here. Here we have, right, Haiti and Santo Domingo, right, Dominican Republic, which were called at that time Hispaniola, the New Spain. That's going to be the first island that's going to be settled, and from there we'll move. Here we have the next island of Puerto Rico on this side, but it wasn't that important. See how tiny it is compared here? So this will be colonized later. And then you have Cuba, because when they start exploring Cuba, they realize that in terms of size, it is much larger, because they're looking for the large islands. And at one point, Columbus and his people thought that this was the islands of Japan. That's what's in the original map, the islands of Japan, because he was looking for a road to Asia. And he thought if he sailed in that direction, what would he hit eventually? He would hit that area of the Pacific, which would have been Eastern Asia, and Japan, right? Sorry, I have to get my finger off the thing. Yeah. So the first islands that we have then are those. And then you can see the closeness to Florida, the interest in Florida. Now the other two islands that are shown here on the bottom, Barbados and Trinidad, they are important because most of the slaves that were brought to South Carolina, when South Carolina is taken by the British, the Carolinas, and established, will come from Barbados and later Trinidad. Because Barbados had already, the English had taken Barbados. It was a very, very profitable sugar plantation island. But if you know anything about Barbados, it's tiny, tiny. And what happened in Barbados? A few families took the little land, had a lot of wealth, but what happened to their sons and their grandsons? Who got the land? One son, right? Primogeniture, the firstborn. So you had this growing population of other individuals that if they don't leave, what can they do? There's no wealth, there's no money. So who recruited them? They were recruited by the leaders of South Carolina or the Carolinas to come and set up a plantation. And they brought them from Barbados, and of course they brought with them their enslaved Africans, who at this point were Caribbean. So this is a wave of Afro-Caribbeans going into South Carolina. These people are the ones who grew the rice in the Barrier Islands. You know them as the Gullah, right? They speak Gullah. And these individuals will run away back to Florida during a period in history. We know them as the Black Seminoles, or Black Indians. And we know the relationship because the Black Seminoles speak a Gullah Seminole language. So you have this circular movement of these Caribbean. You see the links? And that's what happens with the Caribbean. They're all linked. Now, Trinidad is a little bit different, and this is going to be linked to Jamaica. Eventually, the British will take over these islands, and they will take over the slave trade, which was controlled originally by the Portuguese. And these islands became two functions. Seasoning, right? Enslaved Africans, Rosales would be brought in. They would be prepared, kind of stripped of their language, their culture, their religion, because they were going to be enslaved, so you have to prepare them. And then there were clearing stations, clearing houses. This is where they would ship them out when the British took control. And this is where, these islands basically is where most of the enslaved Africans that come to North America come from, as opposed to the early period that they're going to come basically from Cuba. The Spanish period is dominated by Cuba, largest island and the stepping stone. So when we look at these areas, again, you see the connections between all of these islands even then. Okay, okay, I guess I have to do this. So let's go to our next. Now, one of the things that we're going to be examining here, and a lot of these people during this period are runaways. They're going to run away, right? And they weren't the only ones that ran away. Every chance the native population could, they would run away. And a lot of the Spaniard soldiers would run away because it was an opportunity here in the Americas for a certain kind of freedom that they would not have, you know, even in the islands, because once again, Spain would not allow any plantations to be established. Eventually they do, but it's going to be the same system, large tracts of land in one family, so most people don't have access to the land. So what they do is, there's areas that are not explored and they will run away. These individuals that were enslaved Africans and ran away were called in Spanish cimarrones. In English, the British called them maroons, right? And basically the word has to do, from the Spanish, it has to deal with the idea of running into the wild and becoming wild animals. And it refers to pigs that, you let pigs run away. I think with one generation, they're like boars, wild boars. because the Spanish, in Española, the first time, they couldn't understand why these people would run away from the civilized Spanish to go live with the natives in the mountains, which is where they ran away. So these individuals will be descendants, right, of enslaved Africans, and Florida is going to be an ideal location because it was large, basically not settled, not explored, and nobody wanted to come here for several reasons. One of it is it was a lot of jungle, alligators, swamp, hot, and these are not conditions that Europeans were used to. And even the Africans, not all of them were used to it, depending on where they came from. They may have come from desert areas, not jungle areas. So maybe the heat, the warm weather, the rainy, but it was not conditions for them. So where do they go? Most of them to the mountains, and who do they join? The native population. So we know who the first Maroons were in the Caribbean, because basically they arrived in Hispaniola in 1502, and the governor, Obando, complains to the king. They ran away. They ran to the mountains, and they're teaching the natives bad habits. Don't send me anymore. But then he has a problem. Who's going to work the mines in Hispaniola? Who's going to work the mines in Puerto Rico? Who's going to work the mines in Cuba? Who are going to be the servants? So of course, we know what happened. They start again the process of enslavement. And as I mentioned originally, who they wanted to bring were what were called Ladinos, Afro-Spaniards. Many of them had been generations, part of the Moorish conquest of Spain. So their ancestors had been there maybe 700 years. But with the loss of the Muslim Empire in Spain, then those that did not leave, because they had nothing to do with the North Africa, they were basically Spanish. They had generations of Spaniard culture and history, as well as being Muslim. In order to stay in Spain, they had to convert. Okay, they were called Moriscos if they converted. They never trusted them, because of course they converted by force. So you have to convert, but they don't trust them. Same thing happened to the Jewish population. They were called conversos and called maronos, yes. And what's the issue with them? With them, was the same question of conversion, forcing them to convert to the Catholic religion or leave. So they converted. These are the Jews that are called the Sephardic or the Sephardic. Okay? And basically, regardless of where they settled later, the Sephardim means the Jewish population that was forced to leave from Spain. Okay? They're all related to those groups. So you have many that settled in areas of Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, Germany, England, France, those regions. Greece, the Ottoman Empire absorbed a lot of them. And they may be, the tradition may be different, but at their core, right, they are Sephardic, they are Spanish Jews. They can trace, now with the DNA testing, they can trace their legacy to Spain, all right, because there's going to be links with other groups in Spain. The Gypsies were another group that were forced to leave. Three groups: the Moriscos, the Muslims, Sephardic, the Jews, and the Gypsies were also forced to leave. And they were all in that area. A lot of them concentrated in Andalusia, Andalusia. So that's where that culture basically is concentrated. And that part of Spain also is where the Columbus came out, sailed from, and the shipping, the Mediterranean experience, the explorers. This was a history. So we know who the first Maroons were in terms of the New World. Do we know who the first ones in Florida were? Yes, we actually have that documentation. And I know maybe not as exciting to you, but I was fascinated. Who were they? Well, and this is going to be a little bit interesting if you don't know how big Florida and the Spanish Empire was. The Florida Spanish territory extended all the way up to Newfoundland, the whole eastern seaboard, because explorations were done, and the British kind of had plotted some of it. Sebastian Cabot, the Spanish had explored some of it, but the Pope had divided the world, the Treaty of Tordesillas, between the Portuguese on one side and the other side, which was the Americas, to the Spanish. Of course, the English and French didn't care about that, right? You know about the settlement of Virginia and Plymouth, and the French in Canada, the Dutch in the Caribbean eventually. But because of that division, right, Spain basically claimed that whole eastern seaboard. Never got to really settle it, because you need people to settle it, and that didn't happen. So when you see here that the first Spanish settlement in Florida was in South Carolina and then Georgia, because that was, at that time, Spanish territory. Okay, we found into the tip of Florida and then all the way west to Mexico, all the southern United States, where they finally explored. Now, this exploration, like many of them, was a disaster. And this is what's going to happen with every attempt to colonize Florida. Because of the jungle and the alligators and the native population, the mosquitoes and the rain, it was not attractive and it was kind of dangerous. And increasing, as the native population came into contact with the Spaniards, they got increasingly more aggressive and also started to diminish in population through war and disease and enslavement. So we know that about 500 to 700 settlers were brought in by the Aillon, right, in 1526. Did not go well. He ended up being sick and dying. There was a rebellion. That included slaves. We don't know how many exactly, but we do know that finally, when they left, right, when the Spaniards said, we're going back to Cuba, we're not staying here, those 100 slaves at least did not go back. Where did they go? As far as we know, they joined the native population. We have no more history, but the records say that they were missing about this amount of enslaved Africans, and some of them may have been free, because we had Ladinos and Bozales that did not return. This was very common. So what we have now, what we call, this is basically today called the Florida Underground Railroad, the first example of the Underground Railroad, leading into what that time was the wilderness of Florida, which included the Carolinas, South Carolina, and Georgia. Every single attempt to colonize was a disaster, every single one. Everybody failed. What did they all have in common? Enslaved Africans fled, sometimes the soldiers fled too. So you have this whole history of attempting to colonize and it didn't work. So when are we successful? We're not successful until 1565, when we have the establishment of St. Augustine by Pedro de Menendez. Why did Spain decide at that point they have to hold on to Florida? The French had established a fort, an attempt to colonize, right? By north of Fort Cowrie, north of St. Augustine, the Matanzas area, Matanzas River. And that area is called Matanzas, means kill, murder, massacre, because Menendez went in there and basically killed all of the French soldiers that attempted to settle. There was no port to give them. So that region then is finally settled because the Spanish realized if they don't take control of Florida, they're going to lose it to the French and eventually territory like South Carolina and Georgia, they lose it to the English. They also lose Jamaica to the English. So St. Augustine is very interesting because it becomes the first settlement, but that was it. The other one was Pensacola. Two diverse areas, watching the two parts of its empire. And the other one was south, St. Mark's, there's still a fort there, in the St. Mark's River, in the Gulf, and I think it's the Apalachicola River, that area. So what do we know about St. Augustine? Once again, both enslaved and free Africans were part of the population. They were among the first settlers because they are permanent. They were brought in by Menendez to develop the island. The black population at that point was 12% of the population. Okay? Some of them had been born in the Caribbean, so they were not from Africa, they were already Afro-Caribbean. Again, mostly from Cuba, that's the big connection. And when you go into the history, 1 out of every 5 persons in this period were free. So you have this large free population. Increasingly, whenever they needed a population increase, they would come in this period, be brought in from Cuba. And what was their role? To develop, to build the building of the city, the building of St. Augustine, the church, the blacksmith, the building of the fort, eventually the San Marcos, just the original fort. Now, the Maroon community becomes so significant in Florida that they start coming into St. Augustine. And one of the things that they do is they ask the governor of St. Augustine for asylum, for sanctuary. Because according to the Spanish culture, if you are baptized, you can come and request baptism. You might still be enslaved, but you could request baptism, and you would live somewhat free. And you could buy your freedom, you could petition your freedom, you would work, you know, they had a journeyman system, where you would work and you would keep some of your money and give it to the master. So they were very self-sufficient because the Spanish wanted to make money. They didn't want to give money to maintaining them. But this worked for them, right? Because they were able to save money to live. Even as enslaved Africans, they lived freely. They were able to marry. They could, their children would be baptized and would be born free. It didn't matter the status of the mother children would be free and baptized in the church. So this is going to be an attraction. The largest group of enslaved Africans came from South Carolina. And the Black Seminoles in Gullah. How did they hear about it? We don't know. What role do they play? Well, one of the major roles, they're part of the military, the militia. So from conquistadores, now they become part of the military, the defense of Florida on the frontier. And one of the cities that is established is a small fort. There's two forts, the San Marcos, Castillo de San Marcos, and Fort Mose. Significant to Fort Mose, right? Santa Teresa Real, Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Moisés. It was a free settlement given to the enslaved Africans who were the militia, who were freed also. And it became the first free settlement in the Americas before the abolition of slavery in the United States. How long were they there? 1863. What happens in 1863, and this is another Cuba connection. The British took over Florida, and the Spanish left St. Augustine. And this community of free Africans, because at this point they've been free, even if they were runaway, they went to Cuba. They fled to Cuba. They were welcomed there, so Cuba was part of the Underground Railroad. This is another program, but they were part of the Underground. So they went to Cuba. When Spain got Florida back, guess what they did? They came back to Florida, because this was really their foundation, their history. They went to Cuba, they had land, but this is, again, you want your roots, right? And this is 1700s. They're no longer connected in any way to Cuba. So what we're looking at historically now is this back and forth movement is what we call the Afro-Caribbean diaspora. Because one of the things that we notice about this is this movement back and forth. It's always going to be a movement back and forth, return to the homeland. I was born in the United States, but even with that, because of my parents' nostalgia, I have that nostalgia. This ideal of a homeland, of a beautiful island that we came from, rather than New York City, where I grew up. So when you see these images and you see these beaches, and the first time I went, that was my dream too, because this is very different from cold, snowy New York City, right? So we have this Afro-Caribbean diaspora, and basically this is what the Afro-Caribbean society is based on. Why? Because they come to the United States, a lot of them will end up staying, and even if they don't, their children and grandchildren are going to end up staying. That's what happens with the next generations of immigrants. But they still, many of them dream of going back, and many of them do go back when they're retired. Doesn't always work. It doesn't always work, but that's the dream, right? Retire somewhere, and this is the homeland. But they do, a lot of them who do stay, it's a big group, you can see, right? 10% of the immigrants of the United States, the nation, 10% of them are Afro-Caribbean people, and about 4.4 million Caribbean immigrants. And once their children are born here and their grandchildren, and we're getting to the grandchildren and great-grandchildren period, because some of them have been coming here for generations, what is the draw? Money. You come here to work, and the money goes home. And you can see all of the money that is sent from here back home. And this is how these societies are sustained. This is how many families in the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, and Cuba, and Jamaica, this is how they built their houses for retirement. This is how they kind of make that dream. Some of them went back early with their kids, didn't work. Didn't work. So it's retirement. And some of that didn't work either. Where do they settle in Florida? How significant is Florida? Well, you can see the major cities, and you notice that of the major cities, 3 of the main areas are in Florida. Historically, that has always been the link. Okay, so Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm, that group. Orlando, Kissimmee, and Sanford is the next group. And the last group, Tampa, St. Pete. These areas contain the largest portion of the West Indian or Afro-Caribbean. And I'm making a distinction because even though Hispanics, Afro-Caribbean or Hispanic, are technically West Indian, they don't use that term. West Indian is used for the black community, basically. They don't use it for the Haitian, they don't use it for the Hispanic. But we're all West Indian, because West Indies refers to all the islands of the Caribbean, because Columbus thought that he had reached India when he went west. The Cubans, okay? Historically, from the beginning, they are among the first groups. We have 3 groups here that a lot of people don't even realize that they have a somewhat significant Afro-Caribbean population. And one of the issues is whether or not they identify, they self-identify. And the reality is that not everybody does identify, self-identify, or need to, because historically, the roots are there, okay? Afro-Caribbean, I have black ancestry, but I don't have it, we don't see it. And in the United States, it's something that you don't want to emphasize necessarily, especially during certain periods in our history. But there is a large Afro-Caribbean population in all of these islands to a degree in terms of percentage, but we don't know it. In Cuba, because of the communist government, and we don't know their data, their census, there's all this misinformation. In the sense of the Dominican, a lot of it is not recording it, not identifying, because it has to do with self-identification. In the case of Puerto Rico, they do self-identify, but it's a really small number, because Puerto Rico is not significant. It had a fort, the Fortaleza, just like Mark, but St. Augustine, and that was what was important, having a fort. Now, what happens from the beginning in Florida, and this is something that was a concern to Menendez and all the islands, was there was this growing imbalance of the black population versus the Spanish, because there was no interest in coming to Florida. And in 67, right, this is Menendez, he's 1950, 65, he's in St. Augustine. He already is noticing, because he comes originally from, he was like the governor, and he was originally Española, then he was in Cuba, and from Cuba he comes here. He noticed that the population was very unbalanced. You had 30,000 persons that were black ancestry, or black in Hispaniola, versus 2,000 Spaniards. Okay? And Puerto Rico, as tiny as it was, 15,000 to 500. We don't have the numbers. I couldn't find them for Cuba. I hope to find them someday. But it probably was larger because it was at that point the most developed. What is key about all these islands? The forts. This is where the ships with the gold and silver from Mexico and Peru eventually passed in the Atlantic to go to Spain. All these forts were built to watch the Spanish galleons go through, which is why we have all the gold hunters, right? And all the wrecks. And some of these communities will look at them, the Bahamians, that's how they made their living, as wreckers, meaning going into the wrecks and excavating them. So we have this growing population, which only starts to change when more white settlers come in. We really don't have a large portion of white settlers come in until the United States acquires Florida from the Spanish, right, in 1821. At that point, then you have the population from Georgia, Alabama, so Carolina starting to come down here and establish plantations and cattle. And that's when we have then a big change in the population, the white population. The Spanish had never attracted them. They were never interested in coming. So the Cuban community is one I'm going to focus on because they are historically the largest and have the most ties with us here in Florida. The 2019 census, which is the last census I looked at, I haven't updated some of this data, getting all of this and doing it. But you can see that over 1 million of the population of persons of ancestry are in the United States, right? And that community is one of the largest. There are more Cubans in Florida and New York City than there are in Cuba. That's how much the population has grown. But historically, they've also been here a long time. When did they first come? Well, I already talked about, Menendez coming, but they also were brought in specific periods. One major period was the building of the Castillo San Marcos. It was built basically by 18 royal Cuban slaves were brought, and their purpose, it was skilled labor, skilled in excavating the stone, the coquina, right? But also the stone cutting and working with the engineers. And from here, they ended up in the other islands, because all of these particular royal slaves, and they were pretty much free. They were royal slaves, but they were independent. They built the forts all around. So the fort in Cuba, Santo Domingo, Puerto Rico, Cartagena de las Indias, Panama, and they're all going to be built by these groups of native population participated, some European engineers and Spaniards, but these royal slaves basically went to these areas to participate in this building. So we have, again, that link, that original link with Cuba. Who are the Afro-Cubans? Again, historically, they are the largest and oldest group here. Key West has always been their connection, because even before, the question of the Mo people or the migration, the 90 miles, if you wanted to leave Cuba for whatever reason, and you wanted a chance at some kind of a life, right? The way to go was into this unexplored area, the Keys, and then into the mainland. So this was a constant So we have communities that have always existed, Cuban communities, descendants, ancestry here in Key West, Tampa, and we'll see why in a few minutes, but New York, of course, City. In that period, the most we have documented in Miami and in New York City was during the Cuban War of Independence, MacD. Okay, he went to New York, but he was also, I believe, in Florida for a period, trying to get support and money. But in New Orleans, historically, that population there, because Florida, Louisiana was Spanish, then was French, then was Spanish again. Now, when we go into the population here, in the mid-1880s, there were more than 20% of the Cubans that were here were mulatto or black, 20%. And where were they located? Besides, not Miami yet, Key West, they were in Ybor City, Tampa. Why? The cigar industry. And even though in Cuba you had experienced cigar makers that were white, right? This was a primary community that primarily worked in the making of cigars, very large population. And they came first to Key West, and then they came to Ybor City. And for a period of time when the cigars were popular, they were the cigar makers. Now, this particular population, by 1886, so we're talking about, now it's Florida, US. We're talking about a segregated Florida. Keep that in mind. This is post-Civil War. So we now have the segregation and the Jim Crow laws in Florida, because Florida was part of the South. It's unique. Florida's unique. The further north you go in Florida, the more you go into the South, the real Southern culture, as opposed to the cities further south that are more integrated and have more cosmopolitan. So 15% of the Cuban population in Ybor City were Afro-Cubans. 90% were male, because that was a male industry job, sending money back home, remember? It's always been part of it. But they did have women. 50% were women, and the women were strippers. They were the ones that separated. They separated. Now this population, even if it wasn't necessarily literate in terms of reading, they were very, very well informed. Because the tradition in the cigar industry when they're making cigars is to have somebody at the lectern reading the newspapers. So these individuals were very, very well informed of the history of everything, world politics, Cuban politics, New York City, anything, any culture and music, because these readers, that's what they did, read to them while they were working. And again, many of them were probably illiterate, right? Because there were some opportunities that weren't available. What was most interesting is, and I mentioned this was a Southern society, Jim Crow, these were the cigar workers in Ybor City. Look at this picture, what do you see? You see a mixture in the 1890s, Spanish-American War, of black, white, okay, all countries, Greeks, Italians, right, all these groups together, working together in one place in one picture. So even though you had the Jim Crow laws, that segregation did not exist evidently in Ybor City during this period. Because these are the cigar workers, in a picture together and working together. So this is the history of that community. We're going to stop there, and we're going to go to the Bahamians, because we got to go to the rest of the islands. The Bahamians are the other largest community and oldest community here. And of course, you know why? Right? They're so close. Really, right off the coast, right of Florida. So the Bahamian community is also a large one. Now, the issue with Bahamas consists of many, many islands, but only about 2% of the land is arable. Can't grow anything there. You can grow some crops, but they call it subsistence, only to eat. So how did they live? Well, they lived from the sea. Fishermen was a big deal. Wreckers, okay, going here into the Keys and going and treasure hunting. And if they didn't do the treasure hunting, they were very often part of the cruise with the treasure hunters because they know these waters. And sponge, I think fishing they call it, I don't know, collecting, the sponge industry, that was their name. Now, when they start to develop Miami, something new will happen to the Bahamian community. They're going to have another purpose. But there's something else that's interesting about the Bahamian community. When the United States acquired the territory of Florida and there was a transition, these individuals that were black Seminoles that were basically runaway and free slaves, a lot of them realized that since they were considered runaway slaves, they would have been captured and sold into slavery or returned to their masters. And even though the treaty was supposed to guarantee, because they were free, Spain had freed them, guaranteed that they didn't think it was going to happen. So they fled. Where did they flee to? Bahamas. They went down to Miami, to the Bay of Biscayne, to where the park and the lighthouse is, if you're familiar with Miami. They went there, and from there they fled. And they did this from 1823 to about 1830s and 40s. If they could, they fled. And they went to Andros Island in the Bahamas. So there's this connection between the Bahamians, these Seminoles, to the Bahamas, and now connected back here, because some of them returned finding out that they had relatives here that didn't leave. So Andros Island, there's this community there still. In the Bahamas, they're called Black Indians, because the people in Bahamas who know about them remember that they were people who were linked to the Seminoles that fled to the Bahamas. But what was the actual focus of the Bahamians, right? They're going to start coming, as I mentioned, in the 18th century, because they have waves and what I mentioned, fishing, catching turtles, hardwood trees, right, the wreckers. But when we have the establishment of Miami and the building of Miami, they're going to be attracted to Miami. But even in this period, look, 1898, about 18,000 of the 25,000 people in Key West were Bahamian. So it's a really large population for such a small territory. But what happened? They come and establish permanent settlements, because they don't go back, all of them. Where? Coconut Grove in Miami. And why Miami? Because they played a major role in the building of the agriculture and also building of the whole city of Miami, the resorts, Flagler, the tourism. They are the ones. And after they build, what do? They go into the service industry. And at one point, there were more persons of Bahamian ancestry in the Black community than African Americans. They actually outnumber them. So by the 1800s, we already had them establishing in Coconut Grove. And by 96, right, 1896, 40% of the Miami population is Afro-Caribbean, mostly Bahamian. Other groups, but mostly Bahamian. So they have a long history also. By 1920, 52% of the Miami Black population is Bahamian. That's pretty high. And again, people think of them like recent, or as a recent migration. They were the ones that built, constructed Miami. Didn't stay there, they scattered throughout the eastern board, a lot of communities in Lake Worth, in Pompano Beach, all up and down the coast. Okay, this is very common. Now, what we look at for the Bahamians, and this is going to be every group, is a lot of them are seasonal workers, so they go back and forth, right? And they come for agricultural work, and this is still a pattern today. Okay, the Bahamians were basically the black labor force which built the city of Miami, but they also were the ones that did the agriculture, were involved in that. And during the war, World War II, they're going to play a major role, right, in doing that work, boarding as contract laborers. But you can see again that there's another pattern though, coming and returning. And the Bahamians are interesting because they are probably one of the few that have done a significant reverse migration. So many of them were coming, right? Coming here. You can see recruited, 70,000 were recruited between 43 and 47 in the war. Okay, so many of them were coming and staying that the Bahamas got nervous because their territory was being depopulated, and this was a physical drain on their resources, right? This is money not coming into the Bahamian government or the Bahamian society, but they couldn't keep them. So what they do is they expand the tourism industry. And the tourism industry in the Bahamas actually is able to draw back and sustain the Bahamian community. So they successfully were able to reverse their migration, reverse that brain drain and economic drain in their society. Today, tourism is 50% of the Bahamian economy at least. The numbers may be higher or lower. Again, these numbers are like 2000. Well, 2000, no, 20. Before 2018, 17, 18. So tourism is a major role. What do we know about this population? Again, the majority, 21,000 plus, live in Miami. Miami is still their core. 39% hold college degrees. Very highly educated population. The Cuban population is probably one with the highest of degrees. Right? Even though that group is more recent in terms of numbers. But they have a high degree of college degrees and graduate and professional degrees. 35% are in business, science, and the arts. So they're not the service industry anymore. Those days of, early Miami and Flagler and the hotels in Miami, that's basically gone. You don't find it anymore. And a lot of them are in, service occupations, but not hotels, or they're more like in service assisting, like in doctor's offices, that kind of work. So it is a service industry, but not like the hotel industry or the tourism. Now, let's talk very quickly about Bombay and Junkanoo. This is probably one of the things that most people know about them. One of the things I want to say is that Bombay is the drum, right? The drum that you see them playing somewhere, you see the drums. And Junkanoo is not carnival. Has nothing to do with carnival. Junkanoo is a British tradition, because Bahamas was British. It occurs on Boxing Day, which is the day after Christmas. It especially comes from the Protestant that were giving the Christmas Boxing Day off, and they have this tradition. So the music is going to be linked, like I mentioned, to the European, British, the native, and the African, but it comes more out of this holiday celebration that we're given a free day. So it is not at all related. It has some features of carnival, like the costumes, which is why people kind of link it. It's not. And they hold competitions, and this is the big deal in Boxing Day, the 25th in Bahamas, and in Miami. Right? Now, 3 instruments where you get that unique sound: the horns, the bell, and the Bombay drum, which is made out of goat skin. And this is what distinguishes them. And this is one way you know they're not carnival. Because carnival is what industry? What instrument? You know? Trinidad. Yes, the steel drums. Steel pair, the steel pair. That's how you know if it's Junkanoo, or if it's Haitian Rara, we'll talk about that, or if it's Bombay. They have the cowbells and the whistle and the marching. And basically it's a marching. And that's what you do, you march with them. And they dance and they do costumes and competitions, but it's a marching parade. Prominent Bahamians, there's so many of them that I had to eliminate, but Dubois is probably one of the most well-known, founder of the NAACP. He's an interesting individual because his father was Haitian, but his grandfather was Bahamian. And he was the first black man to graduate from Harvard. He was a sociologist who studied in Germany in the 1800s, 1890s. His mentor or his professor was Max Weber, a prominent German sociologist from conflict theory, but a particular conflict version. Now we're going to go to another community, the Jamaicans. Right? Now the Jamaicans, remember I mentioned that the island of Jamaica was a stepping stone for slaves that were prepared. So we also have a long history of these, Afro-Caribbeans from Jamaica in North America, basically, plantations of the South. They might have been in the cities also, but we're talking about plantation society were the ones that most depended on slave labor. So when we look at the population living in the United States, we have over 1 million currently of Jamaican ancestry living. I have family of Jamaican ancestry. I have a brother-in-law who's Jamaican. My family has that ancestry linked in there. My family is the Caribbean. Pick an island, and you'll probably find one of the islands we have got some connection. First Jamaicans in America, right? In 1665, the English had taken control of Jamaica, and what they start doing is using the island as a stepping stone. And once it's captured, they brought in over 1 million enslaved Africans, brought to Jamaica alone. They escaped into the mountains, the maroons, but most of them were prepared to be brought into other parts of the Americas as, enslaved Africans. And it was a way station, a stopping, and a clearinghouse. So stopping to season them, to get them ready, teach them how to be slaves, teach them to labor, kind of break their spirit, which didn't happen because a lot of them ended up in Florida as a sanctuary, and a clearinghouse. Now, in 1865, after the Emancipation Proclamation, right, and the 13th Amendment, freeing slaves, the black population did everything it could not to work on the plantations. Unfortunately, they got involved in what was called they left my brain for a second. They would work for the owner and on contract labor, right? It would come to me. But they didn't want to do that because they wanted freedom. They wanted that freedom to, no matter what they did, they wanted that freedom. So what happens is they need workers. So these southern plantation owners start to contract Jamaicans, which is an advantage. They call them swallow migrants because they flew back after the season. So they're not a permanent population. They didn't want to increase the black population, but they needed laborers. So this is going to be a pattern of bringing in these workers from Jamaica and Bahamas and other places to work for a period and go back. During World War II, this is going to be a primary source of labor, because what happens to the African American population in World War II and World War I? They go to war. So anybody who worked in agriculture or worked in the factories, they're now fighting overseas. So you need laborers. So you have the bracero, which were the Mexican laborers. This is not bracero, this is contract labor, which is still going on, by the way. And 90,000 were recruited to work in the Panama Canal. There is still a city in Panama called Limon, which is a Jamaican community. You go in there and you're talking to a Jamaican. No loss of accent, the music, the food, nothing. You're in Jamaica, some small town in Jamaica. Migration waves, again, the biggest waves, new wave in modern times was in 43 to 47, about 70,000 migrant workers, West Indians, would be the English, Bahamian, and Jamaican, were brought into, and Trinidad a little bit, to work as agricultural workers to replace the laborers that left. You have 10 to 15,000 were brought to Florida as contract, and they're still brought that way. And in the 60s, the migration increased when we had a nurse shortage, because the nurses in Jamaica were trained in England and in Canada. Remember, those were colonies of the British, Jamaica, Canada, and even today, the Queen still, and that was Charles, right, on the main, I think on the money, and also like loyalty or something. So that link is still there. So they were, we needed nurses. There was a nursing shortage, and they were teachers too. But nursing was a big deal. A lot of Jamaican nurses who had studied and they spoke English, Jamaica speak, and studied in England, and were trained, and they brought them in. And then we have another issue in the 70s and 80s, which happens to every country. Every country has suffered this. We call it a brain drain. When the people with the most skills, because the nurses came, and those were nurses that were not in Jamaica anymore. That population. Doctors that left, that's a population that's gone from Jamaica. Teachers, because we had a lot of new teachers that came, that's a population. So every time that you have this professional class leave these countries, we call it a brain drain, because now we don't have the people we need in those societies to develop the society. Same thing happened in Cuba. First million Castro takeover, the first million Cubans that left were the entire population of teachers, lawyers, engineers, doctors, right? And that left a population that basically worked agriculture, and no industry, because Cuba was not industrialized. This is the same problem in all the islands. And again, they sustain, this is why it's important to come here and work, because that's how they sustain their communities, by sending money home. Jamaicans and Florida, they represent 25% of the population of Florida, and their ancestry, long history, so this is why. But we also have large communities in New York City. Those are probably the two major cities. High group, 24% of Caribbean community that has college degrees. I think the Cubans are higher, 25 or 26%, if I remember correctly. But they're there. That's two groups that are close, right? 61% are actually born or naturalized citizens. They're not illegal. They're not illegal here. And you notice, born, right? Most are employed, again, they made that transition, business, science, arts. Not working in that other level of service industry anymore. And we know who the key Jamaican is, right? Everybody knows, there's so many, but Marley. And what's interesting about Marley, he is a global figure. He is known by everybody globally. There's like statues and tributes to him all over the world. And he introduced a new style of music, the reggae, which became, there's other forms of music. We have the soca and we have calypso, but this came to dominate because Belafonte's music, what he was singing in the 50s, was calypso. But this is a whole new, the reggae, which has been translated into other cultures and forms of it, in Spanish, reggaeton. The next and last group we're going to see here is the Haitian community, another large population, over 1 million in the United States. The Haitian Florida, over 2/3 live in Florida or New York. And actually, Florida has the larger population. The population in Florida is 2.4% of the state population. So it's a small number, but this is where they're mostly located. And it has to do with the more controlled immigration. Excuse me. The largest historical culture enclave is Little Haiti. Although Little Haiti is suffering because the the design district is encroaching. That whole area of Miami is changing dramatically. So those little houses in Little Haiti now that some of the Haitian community have held on to, they're disappearing. They're getting good money if they can because you have that whole design district moving further north. But this particular area, Little Haiti, and on the river, the Hudson, the Edison Little Haiti River section was where the Haitian community basically established themselves. Characteristics, again, higher education, 79% ages 25 and over have a high school degree, higher than I think Black Americans and some other groups, so very high. Immigrants, 19% or higher, bachelor's degrees or higher. Very highly motivated for education, like every community, in that sense, and that's where they follow the pattern of all other groups that came in, Jamaicans and Cubans. The labor force, this is where they're a little different, okay? One of the issues with this particular community, they're still basically linked to the labor force of service industry. You're still gonna find many of them working in housekeeping, some form of tourism, groundwork, etc. But their participation, they have a higher participation in the labor force than the U.S. born population. Haitian women are more likely to work in the labor force than the overall immigrant population. More of the Haitian women employed, again, in the service industry. I noticed in the resort this morning that there were a lot of Haitian workers. Concentration, and you can see here, they are employed in different areas, but basically it's the service industry. This is the service industry. But you have some other areas, right? You have some other areas, but they're basically employed in the service industry. So all immigrants is the dark green. This light green right here, come on, it's a little hard to see this light green. You can see how they dominate in this industry. But that doesn't mean that they're not in business and the arts. A lot of them are in the health fields. A lot of them are own private businesses, right? And a lot are involved in some kind of sales. Now, they also went through waves, but the waves are different. You have the period of Duvalier, Papadak, so these were political exiles, fleeing, and this is where you have a population that would be an example of the brain drain. Because these people who left were mostly the more educated, the most dangerous, the ones that would question. You had, again, doctors, nurses, lawyers, engineers at brain drain, which is a problem with the Haitian community, and this continues to happen. The boat people that came later, you have the less educated, but they come here, they do get their education, we see that, but they don't necessarily go back to develop the country because there's nothing happening there except violence, right, and continued political unrest. Then you have the 72, which is a big number, the Haitian boatload of Haitian refugees that came, the boat people, which came at the same time with that wave of Cuban boat people. Oops, sorry. And you also have, okay. You also had the 60s and 70s. You had a lot of what we would call blue-collar workers and semi-skilled workers in the 60s and 70s. Again, another more educated population working in New York City, working in those kinds of jobs. Not necessarily Florida. They went to New York City. This was an area that had more of a need for this kind of labor. And then after the earthquake, we had a large number of the population that were given temporary visas. In 21, increasing violence had escalated with the assassination of the then president of Haiti. And what's happening in 22 and now is this escalating violence. Every day there is some kind of a ransom. I personally know so many family members or friends who have been kidnapped to be ransomed for whatever money they can get. And some of them are high-profile persons of business in Haiti, so we're talking about ransoms that are like in the millions, right? Millions. They're asking for $5 million if they can get it, and sometimes they get it. And sometimes the hostages survive, sometimes they don't. The money doesn't come if it's not fast enough, you know. Sometimes they've already died because, you know, taking them it's not easy, but you don't know that until the money's paid and then they never show up. So this is an issue and a problem, and why you have this continuing wave from Haiti. Again, since the assassination, it has only gotten worse, totally worse, and we don't know when this is going to end better, because there's so much instability and such a lack of development and so much poverty in this country. And so when we have this continuous violence, but also this constant political and economic deterioration problems in the island. Now, I did want to address some links to the United States, little known facts about the Haitian community. The Haitian Tuskegee Airmen. You've all heard of the Tuskegee Airmen, I'm sure, right? The African-American pilot. There were some, and he may still be alive. The last I checked on him, he was still alive. In 2023, I think recently. I just checked in December. His birthday was September. He was still alive, living in, I think, Sanford now or something. Oh no, he went back to Alabama. He was living in Sanford. So he was a Tuskegee Airman. And he right now, he's still alive. As the last time I checked, he's the only surviving person of black, ancestry alive from the Tuskegee Airmen. All of the others have died. So he was one of them. During the period of exploration and colonization, we had Jean-Baptiste Pontoussaint, who was considered to be the founder of Chicago. Did you know that? He established a settlement, the first settlement in what came to be Chicago, and he's recognized today as being the first person to develop that area. This is his statue in the city of Chicago. And during the American Revolution, at that point, the French, Haiti was connected. Haiti had already was already involved in developing its population toward, not yet toward independence, but you had this military presence there with the French. And what they did was, during the American Revolution, they were allied, the French, remember, supported the Americans. They sent a group of Haitian soldiers to Georgia in the Battle of Savannah. And this statue was erected there, recognizing this particular group of soldiers that were all Africans from Haiti. So they made significant contributions to American history. Last note, Haitian Rara is not carnival. And Haitian Rara is not jump canoe. It is unique to Haiti. Unlike the jump canoe, which is December 25th, and Carnival, which is just before Ash Wednesday to get ready. It's based on the Catholic Lent period, get ready for Easter Lent. This celebration starts on Ash Wednesday and continues to Easter week. And it's a preparation for the coming back of Christ, the resurrection. Very strongly linked to the Haitian culture, to voodoo, that tradition, and to the Catholic religion, those three. So you have the Catholic part is getting ready for Christ, but all of the tradition comes into the celebration of, the voodoo, a lot of that. And these are the instruments. You see how different the instruments are? Let me see if this plays, because sometimes things don't play. But these instruments are the main instruments of Rara. Maybe you play, maybe you won't. We'll see. They're wind instruments. You can see it's bamboo, but there's the drum. Maybe not. No, won't play. Won't play. Never know when they will play. But they're different. Now, you see this horn? Yeah. Totally different than what we heard in the other islands, right? This is totally different because they're all like long instruments. And I'm going to stop it because I want to Google it. Not yet. Okay. You have a test, by the way. Yeah. 40 plus years as a teacher. I have to give you a test. Okay, but going back to this instrument, 2 years ago I was in a celebration of Spanish culture in the 16th century, 17th century, and they had some musicians that came from Europe, and they had these wind instruments that they played, and guess what they look like? That horn. That long, long metal horn here, these instruments exactly. I was like fascinated. I think I have pictures of it. So again, the European, what I mentioned, has always been a European link to wherever the instruments are, a different adaptation. And what they do is they also hold parades and everybody follows and they kind of go through the streets from town to town. This is a real rural, cultural, the community base. Okay? Well, what I'm going to do is we're at the end and I'm going to give you a test. This is the Haitian group. If you heard their music is based on the rah-rah sound, but very modern with modern horns and drums. All right, so let's have a test. Can you see the screen with the people? Their names are there. Look at them quickly and see if any surprise you, how many you recognize, and think if you know where they're from, right? And if you can't see them, I'll read some of them out. Okay, we have over here the obvious one, so you don't get points for that one. You have Kamala, right? Paris, right? Jamaica. But how about the others here? Come on, guys. Tell me what you recognize. Give me some. Did you know where they're from? Where do you think they're from?
Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
Okay, who?
Alfonso Ribeiro.
Yes. And you know where he's from?
I do not.
Ah, okay. But yes, but he's from the Caribbean. I'm not going to write it yet so you'll see. Anybody else recognize somebody? Oh, come. Look at the last one on the right. I know you guys recognize him.
Oh.
Oh, look at the last person on the right.
Sammy Davis Jr.
Sammy Davis Jr. Yes, Afro-Caribbean. Yes. Okay, for anybody in basketball or sports, Kyle Thompson. Right, Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean. Jean-Michel Esquat, right? Another one, artist from the 70s. You might see him on the CBS News, right? What's his name again? Vladimir, even I can't see it. Vladimir Gutier, yeah. Caribbean, okay. All right, Esther Raleigh. You know her, Esther Raleigh? Yes. JJ, the star is now making commercials for Medicare. She actually was from the, how do you call it? Boynton Beach, that region. That's where she's from. Okay. Meriwether, a boxer. Okay. Belafonte, obvious, right? Gina Torres, actor. Okay, Sidney Poitier. Okay, everybody knows him, but where, which island? Jada, what is it? Yeah, Jada Smith. Whose wife is she?
Will Smith.
Yes, she's from the Caribbean. Yes. Nicki, what is it? Minaj. Okay, Caribbean. So let's find out where they're from. Lester Holt. He does that detective show, you know, right? Yeah. So let's see, Cicely Tyson. So let's see where they're from. Okay. Nope. Yeah. Sorry, guys. Okay, so here we have them. Of course, Wyclef Jean, Haiti. Zoe Saldana, she's from the Dominican Republic of Puerto Rico. Going back to our friend, Sammy Davis Jr., it was believed for many years, up until about the 1990s, that he was actually, his mother was Puerto Rican. Very recently, an actual biography that was released, because he didn't let it release right away, he indicated, no, that his mother was from Cuba. The reason he said Puerto Rico was, think about it, 1950s, New York City, Cuban Revolution, communists, Cubans and communists are coming here. He did not want to have his career impacted with the possibility, because this is the 50s, remember the House Committee, right, by McCarthy era. He did not want to be subjected to that, because who did McCarthy go after? The artist industry, right? So he said he was from Puerto Rico, but his mother was Cuban. He's Rivero from Good Times. No, Good Times. Freshman. Good Times is Esther Raleigh. Rivero from Trinidad. Okay. Of course, I already mentioned Dubois. Lester Holt, he's from Jamaica. Bahamian for Esther Raleigh. All right. Saldana, I mentioned Dominican Republic and Puerto Rican. Anybody else here that was you know, Minaj is from Trinidad. Jada Smith is from Jamaica. Tyson is from Nevis, another small island. Kyle Thompson, the Bahamian. So did you know how many of these individuals? Okay, did you know? So basically, we all, my husband and I, all have Afro-Caribbean ancestry. And many of you probably have friends and family also. So thank you very much. I'll try to go as fast as I could. Anything that I missed, anything, if you want to contact me, you can use that. I also have cards. I do other presentations. I have a whole series of comic books. History of comic books, but how they reflect society. And one is about female superheroes. What are their real powers? Any questions for me?
I have a microphone here if you want me to come over to you. I have a question.
Okay.
You were really passionate throughout that presentation, which is amazing, right? way to captivate your audience. So I was wondering if there was one specific event that kind of led you to developing and presenting this program, or, you know, something like that.
Well, I am Puerto Rican by ancestry, development, family. I was born in New York City. You can hear my accent. That's actually a real New Yorker, because I was born in Manhattan. But I grew up in the 50s and 60s being told I was Puerto Rican, but not knowing what that meant. And not really being American, but me, I was American. I mean, come on, I was American. I spoke English, I didn't understand Spanish, and spoke it, but I was American. But that question of acceptance, and that question of who am I? And then at 14, I went to Puerto Rico, and my cousin said, oh, you're a gringa, you're not Puerto Rican. So where did I fit? So it's this question of a search for identity, and importance of identity. And for my family, which is very mixed in terms of marriage, I have a sister whose husband is Jamaican, so I have Jamaican, Puerto Rican, nieces and nephews. We have people from Trinidad, we have family from Bahamas, my husband is Haitian. So these children, all these mixes, I felt that it was important. I wanted to know my history, but I felt that it's important then to let everybody else know about this history, which you're not going to find. You're not going to find it in history books necessarily. It's not common. You have to really look for it. And then I was teaching at the college. I taught 40 plus years, and I used to always be involved in what they call the heritage months, Black History. And I remember there was a fight with somebody at the campus because I wanted to talk about the Afro-Caribbean. They get the Black history and American history in the classroom, but the Caribbean, and there's all these misunderstandings. And they were fighting because this was African American history. I said, no. Heritage Month is Black History Month. And the African Americans are Black, but the Caribbean people are also Black. So this is Black history, and they're American. So I developed programs there and with the students to educate the community about these. A lot of the students I taught in Homestead and make them aware of their heritage and to kind of leave something for my nieces and nephews. But it's a question of, you want to know how many of you have done the Ancestry.com or something like that? You want to know your history. You want to know your links. You want to know why, your name is a certain, or where you have these memories, where did these stories. So that was for me like a search for that. Because I really grew up with not fitting anywhere in the 50s and 60s. I didn't fit anywhere. I wasn't American, I really wasn't Puerto Rican. I guess I was, but I wasn't. And I am an American of Puerto Rican ancestry. Because I was born and raised in this country, and that's my first culture. I do have the Puerto Rican, because I was raised by my grandmother, and it's strong, and I just speak the language. But I am an American. New Yorker. Nobody has a question? Yes, dear.
I just would like to know for our museum, have you written a book or a paper that we could keep in our library?
No. These programs are being developed into a book, a digital library.
All right,
Really.
will you remember that?
I'll remember if that's what you're interested in, yes. One of the things that I'm working with, because I'm retired, been retired from Miami-Dade College since 2016. And now I do this, which is what I love, because I get to do the things I couldn't do in the classroom. Because you're limited, there's certain topics that you have to meet guidelines. So these programs were also, now I love sharing this. And I am working with a group of scholars, and we are in the process of doing a digital library rather than a printed book. Because today everything, if you go to the internet, and you have more accessibility actually, it's incredible. A lot of the information, like the crew manifest, I found it online. I found Columbus's crew manifest, okay? And I read it, but who was on it? I know who the first person to set foot in the island Columbus group. He was a converso Jew, because he was the interpreter for Columbus. So a Jewish person, all right, a Sephardic Jew, was the first person to set foot in San Salvador, when Columbus landed. Not Columbus, may have come later. So this history, but I saw that and I knew if he was the interpreter and the guy in the crow's nest was another person of Jewish ancestry, then who saw land first? Not Columbus, which is a lie. The guy in the crow's nest, isn't that what they're supposed to do? So looking at the list, and that one shows that he also had persons of African ancestry. His pilot of the Santa Maria was Alfonso Niño, a free black man. The owner of the Pinta was his brother, so he owned one of the ships. They were not slaves, they were not in the galley. He was the pilot, his brother owned the ship. And then he had a servant, Diego Salcedo, who in those days, if you were a slave, they would say esclavo. So he was a servant, young black man, boy, Diego Salcedo. So if you look at these documents online. So I'm gonna, it's gonna go. These presentations will be formed into a book edition. Anybody else?
Well, thank you all very much for joining us and for your patience while we waited for our handful of guests that got stuck in that terrible traffic jam. To those of you who made it, thank you for braving that terrible traffic so that you could participate in our program today. And thanks again for joining us. Please register for next Wednesday, the 14th. We'll be having Kristen Hines do our evening lecture. She's a wildlife photographer, and she's just published a book on Florida wildlife. So look forward to seeing you next Wednesday here for that. Thanks again. This is Lamarre. Okay, sure.
I know I kind of started going back, but I wasn't sure.
Lisa has a quick announcement.
I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Lisa. I'm the new marketing coordinator here at the museum, and I'm super excited. Vivian was helping me because this is my first event. So thank you, Vivian. Also, I did record today's presentation. So if you showed up late or you'd like a copy of it, just feel free to see me and I'll make sure to email it to you. All right? Thanks.